it's not going to be a matter of just pointing out white supremacy. Of course, white supremacy is a fundamental foundation and part of the country. It's not the only foundation, because you got resistance to white supremacy. You got Lydia Maria Child. She wrote a book in 1834 called An Appeal for that class of Americans called Africans. It was deeply influenced by one of the greatest works ever written at that time by David Walker, Appeal to Colored Citizens of the World. She's a white sister. She is as vanilla as Doris Day in the 1830s, fundamental part of the Black freedom movement, right? Well, you see, those folk need to be lifted up, because what does that do? That exposes our humanity in terms of the choices we make, not just the skin color we have.
Welcome to Literary Hangover. I'm Matt Leck, writing solo for the second time. And what you just heard was Cornel West, Dr. Cornel West, on the Joe Rogan Experience, episode 1325, mentioning Lydia Maria Child on the Joe Rogan Experience. I think that's definitely a first. And that's who we're talking about today. We aren't talking about her book, An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans, which was the first anti-slavery work in America in book form. That was in 1833. We're talking about today a book called Hobomok, A Tale of Early Times. This was written in 1824 when Lydia was only 22 years old. So you'll notice only a year after The Pioneers by James Fenimore Cooper, and indeed she mentions the Pioneers in the preface. Also Walter Scott. We'll get to that later. I wanted to get to this finally, because everybody knows about James Fenimore Cooper. Those are the novels that have made it down for, I think, complex reasons that are related to empire building and colonialism. But we've done 2 episodes on Catherine Maria Sedgwick's Hope Leslie, and this is sort of the precursor to Hope Leslie. And indeed, Lydia Maria Child knew Margaret Fuller. They were friends, and was at one time a tutor for Sedgwick. And I think Hope Leslie develops Hobomok, which is a much shorter novel, later into, and they both offer a sort of contrast to Cooper. And Cooper's later works, The Wept of Wishton Wish and The Last of the Mohicans, respond actually to the those two women's take on particularly what happens to mixed race couples. We'll get to that also later. I want to bring in for the first time the work of Carolyn L. Karcher. She wrote this book, The First Woman in the Republic, A Cultural Biography of Lydia Maria Child, and it's a big book. So this is going to be the exclusive solo source for this episode this week. And I want to point out here the debt owed, and I don't know if I've stressed this enough in previous episodes, to basically a series of feminist scholars in the 80s, is my impression, that unearthed, not totally, but brought into sort of respectable light the works of Catherine Maria Sedgwick and Lydia Maria Child. I mean, we talk about in the Orwell series about certain things being lost to history for ideological reasons. And I think definitely that's how you explain the difference between why we don't remember people like Lydia Maria Child and Catherine Maria Sedgwick and do remember Cooper. A fun fact about Lydia Maria Child is she wrote this.
Over the river and through the wood to grandmother's house we go. The horse knows
except it wasn't to grandmother's. She wrote it to grandfather's house. And but yeah, let's get to this introduction, I think, by Carolyn L. Karcher, and for a bit more on the significance of Lydia Maria Child.
For half a century Lydia Maria Child was a household name in America. The famous anti-slavery agitator William Lloyd Garrison hailed her as the first woman in the Republic. The radical Republican Senator Charles Sumner credited her with inspiring his career as an advocate of racial equality and sought her advice on Reconstruction policy. Samuel Jackson, an African-American correspondent of Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, proposed enshrining her alongside John Brown in the pantheon of his people's white benefactors. The suffragist leader Elizabeth Cady Stanton cited Child's Encyclopedic History of the Condition of Women, 1835, as an invaluable resource for feminists in their battle against patriarchal ideology. The transcendentalist theologian Theodore Parker pronounced her monumental progress of religious ideas, the book of the age, and written by a woman. A newspaperman ranked her popular weekly column of the 1840s, Letters from New York, almost at the head of journalism in America. Edgar Allan Poe praised her novel Philithea, 1836, as an honor to our country, and a signal triumph for our countrywomen. The National Anti-Slavery Standard proclaimed her Romance of the Republic, one of the most thrilling books ever written, involving the rights of the colored people not accepting Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Child's earliest biographer, the abolitionist Thomas Wentworth Higginson, converted by her 1833 appeal in favor of that class of Americans called Africans, paid tribute to it as the ablest and most comprehensive anti-slavery book ever printed in America. Tracing her formative influence on the activists of his generation back to the intellectual provision she had furnished them in their youth, he reminisced, in those days she seemed to supply a sufficient literature for any family through her own unaided pen. Thence came novels for the parlor, cookery books for the kitchen, and the juvenile miscellany for the nursery. Secure though her reputation seemed in the wake of the Civil War, Child was erased from history when the backlash against Reconstruction that began even before her death destroyed almost everything she had fought for. She survived in public memory only through a children's Thanksgiving song whose authorship none but specialists could identify, Over the River and Through the Wood, /To Grandfather's House We Go To. Ironically, it projects a cozy image of New England family life belied by the poverty, hardship, and isolation Child endured over a long career of self-sacrificing political advocacy. No less ironically, she is most often reintroduced to the public these days not as an author in her own right, but as the editor of a slave narrative which had originally required her endorsement and authentication before a publisher would print it. Harriet A. Jacobs's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, 1861. Child herself might have relished this status reversal as the consummation of her life's work. When the African-American minister Hiram R. Revels won a U.S. Senate seat in 1870, she exulted, "His election is an epoch in our history. It marks the first great step in the emancipation of the white race from the enslavement of an unjust and absurd prejudice." But contrary to her hopes, the overturn of Reconstruction in her last years marked a giant step backward, relegating the prospect of the white race's emancipation from prejudice to an indefinite future and sweeping the anti-slavery movement into near oblivion. Child would languish in obscurity for nearly a century. Not until the civil rights movement created a more favorable climate for reassessing the abolitionist legacy would reprints of her works begin to appear, and then only in facsimile editions for libraries. The first biography to bring Child back before the public in the mid-1960s, Helene G. Bayer's The Heart is Like Heaven, reflected the fashionable distaste for radical reformers, sentimentalizing Child as an adoring wife who took up anti-slavery politics solely to please her husband. The second, Milton Meltzer's Tongue of Flame, 1965, honored her courage as a reformer and held her up as a role model, written primarily for the audience Child herself had addressed in the juvenile miscellany. However, it necessarily smoothed out complexities beyond the grasp of youthful minds. 4 Although a trickle of scholarly articles and book chapters followed in the 1970s, 5 no doubt stimulated by second-wave feminism and the birth of women's studies.
Compared to other authors, she had financial troubles significantly, especially involved with her husband, who was also a sort of abolitionist rabble-rouser, sort of. We won't get into him. She didn't meet him until after she wrote Hobomok. And actually, let's go through her timeline a little bit here. So born Lydia Francis, 1802, February 11th, in Medford, Massachusetts, another, New England writer. In 1811, her brother Converse Francis Jr. matriculates to Harvard. And that was significant because Lydia often read his books, despite being 6 years younger than him, or around there. Apparently, it never occurred to her that she wouldn't be mature enough to read these books, so she had access to this sort of literature. From 1811 to 1814, her mother suffering and then eventually dies from tuberculosis. 1817, we have her first surviving letter to her father. It's on Paradise Lost, basically about how a bit of over-masculine energy to it. In 1820 is where things really start to get interesting for her. She moves to Maine to teach, and she reads things like Ivanhoe, Walter Scott, Don Juan. She gets into Swedenborgianism, which I think we might have to get into. Maybe do a special episode on that. It's sort of like a mix between a sort of feminist or proto-feminist. It's sort of taught of the complementarity of the sexes, and sort of comparisons to tantric Buddhism. I don't know. We maybe need to do some more research. They came up a lot in my Utopia research as well. And what's also significant about 1820 when she's in Maine is a couple things on in terms of racial conflict in America. You have her, you have the Missouri Compromise, and she's in Maine. And so what that, for people who don't know, Maine was a part of Massachusetts. They vote for their independent to become their own free state in 1819. In 1820, it's announced that that's conditional on the acceptance of Missouri as a slave state, the Missouri Compromise. And that really radicalized Lydia Maria Child into becoming an abolitionist eventually. And then also she's exposed to Native Americans for the first time. One thing that really stuck with her was a woman during the winter came asking for food, and it turned out that she had just given birth the previous day, and Child found that out later, and it stuck with her because of how the hardiness, I guess, of how the strength of women, and that sort of taught Child that, there's nothing women, like the idea that women can't do things men can do is something that's definitely overlearned and often false.
I used to go to the woods and visit the dozen wigwams that stood there. Very often, she reports in one of her juvenile miscellany sketches, the Indian boy 49, she never went empty-handed, for the effects of their brutal dispossession lingered on among the impoverished Abenaki and Penobscot. But the cultural enrichment Child derived from these contacts made them more than visits of charity. As she watched the Indians weave and dye baskets, listened to the stories they told, and daydreamed about the freedom their mode of life seemed to offer, she was imperceptibly developing into the author of Hobomok. Like her heroine Mary Conant, Child may have indulged in romantic fantasies of eloping with an Indian. In dwelling on Hobomok's tall, athletic form, manly beauty, and elastic, vigorous elegance of proportion, 1636, was she expressing the attraction she had felt toward Alexis. 50 Did the rebellious impulses she shared with her heroine sometimes take the form of wondering whether marrying an Indian whose nature was unwarped by the artifices of civilized life might be more desirable than submitting to the restrictions civilized life imposed on women? 121. One restriction to which Child refused to submit was the curtailment of her education. Unlike Medford, Norridgewock boasted neither a female seminary nor a male college preparatory academy, but once again it did allow Child access to the same opportunities for education open to the town's best families. There, the baker's daughter could attend summer classes given by students from Bowdoin College. Better still, she could range through the shelves of the town library, where Warren Preston, one of its founders, officiated as librarian. 51. Encouraged from a distance by converse, Child tackled Samuel Johnson, Addison, Gibbon, Scott, Milton, and Shakespeare, recording her opinions, ambitions, and assessments of herself in lively letters. At times, she audaciously declared her independence. Whether the ideas I have formed be erroneous or not, she responded tartly when converse accused her of misreading Paradise Lost, they are entirely my own. At others, she humbly admitted to a need for greater intellectual self-discipline and maturity. I am aware that I have been too indolent in examining the systems of great writers, that I have not enough cultivated habits of thought and reflection upon any subject. The consequence is, my imagination has ripened before my judgment, I have quickness of perception, without profoundness of thought, I can at one glance take in a subject as displayed by another, but I am incapable of investigation. 52 The self-criticism was astute, and she obviously fulfilled her intention of remedying the shortcomings she noted, for investigation was to prove her forte in the many historical works she went on to publish. Most suggestive are her comments on Scott's women characters, prefiguring as they do the rebellious heroine's Child would before long create in her own fiction.
Once again, we see the influence of Walter Scott.
And she obviously fulfilled her intention of remedying the shortcomings she noted, for investigation was to prove her forte in the many historical works she went on to publish. Most suggestive are her comments on Scott's women characters, prefiguring as they do the rebellious heroine's Child would before long create in her own fiction. I always preferred the impetuous grandeur of the cataract to the gentle meanderings of the rill, in spite of all that is said about gentleness, modesty, and timidity in the heroine of a novel or poem, give me the mixture of pathos and grandeur exhibited in the character of Meg Merrilies, or the wild dignity of Diana Vernon, with all the freedom of a Highland maiden in her step and in her eye. Or even the lofty contempt of life and danger which, though not unmixed with ferocity, throws such a peculiar interest around Helen MacGregor. In life I am aware that gentleness and modesty form the distinguished ornaments of our sex. But in description they cannot captivate the imagination, nor rivet the attention. 53. Identifying with these wild and daring Highland lassies, so much akin to the Indian women she admired, allowed Child to escape vicariously from a feminine ideal she found as boring in life as in literature. While unconsciously preparing for a career of authorship, consciously Child was studying to be a schoolteacher. In March 1820, a month after her 19th birthday, she wrote Converse to announce the good news: I leave Norwich Walk, and take a school in Gardner. What delighted her most about the prospect was that she would be earning her own living. Not that I have formed any high-flown expectations, she quickly interjected. All I expect is, that, if I am industrious and prudent I shall be independent. She did not yet realize, apparently, how radical an aspiration independence was for a 19th century woman.
The Maine is a very instructive time for her, despite herself being a teacher. In 1821, she does move back to Massachusetts, to Watertown, Massachusetts, where her brother Converse is established in the church there. That's actually, she gets baptized in the Congregational Church, and that's where she picks up the name Maria. 1822, she joins the Swedenborgian Society of New Jerusalem in Boston. And then in 1824 is when she writes Hobomok in 6 weeks. The first reviews appear in July. Let's go back to Karcher once again and discuss Hobomok and where the inspiration came from.
Hobomok, A Tale of Early Times, opens with an autobiographical vignette depicting its author's dramatic entry onto the American literary scene. Bursting into the study of a friend we can easily recognize as Converse Francis, the young artist-to-be brashly announces his intention to write a New England novel, an intention prompted, as Child's was, by a Mr. P. Alfrey's remarks concerning our early history. Through her male persona, Child articulates her unwomanly aspiration to express the dormant energies of my soul and to win an epitaph in the male sphere of public action instead of in the female sphere of domestic life. Like Converse, her fictional persona's friend agrees to further the enterprise by procuring as many old, historical pamphlets as possible. And like Child, her persona self-consciously surveys a literary landscape dominated by Sir Walter Scott and James Fenimore Cooper, and proceeds to stake out the ground that remains unexplored. This vignette, which constitutes the preface to the novel, suggests how Child met the challenge of defining herself as an author in an era when authorship was still almost entirely the prerogative of an educated male elite. She began by identifying herself so thoroughly with her elder brother that she all but assumed his gender. Just as she had taken refuge in his bedroom and devoured his books while he was fitting himself for college, so she now ensconced herself in his study and enlisted his aid in fulfilling her literary ambition. At age 7 or 8, it had not occurred to her that the books of a schoolboy 6 years her senior were beyond her childish comprehension. No more did it occur to her at age 22 that she could not claim the right to a public career her brother took for granted. Child seems never to have suffered from either the fear of unsexing herself or the paralyzing sense of inadequacy that inhibited so many other 19th century women writers. In keeping with her male identification, she looked for literary precursors among male writers, showing no discernible awareness of being disqualified by gender from inheriting, or appropriating, their mantle. Simultaneously, she treated their texts with the same iconoclasm she had displayed as a 15-year-old when she had questioned Milton's lordly assertion of masculine superiority. Intuitively recognizing the problems posed by patriarchal literary conventions, she boldly revised them to accord women greater freedom and dignity. The anxiety Child acknowledges in the preface to Hobomok is not that of a woman entering a domain reserved for men. It is the anxiety of an American seeking to demonstrate that New England's history offers as much scope as Old England's, and Scotland's, for the homegrown novelist hoping to emulate Scott. Aspiring American writers indeed faced a daunting prospect in 1824, as they groped for direction. Irving had just published the sketchbook in 1819-20, Cooper the Spy in 1821 and the Pioneers in 1823. As for predecessors like Susanna Rowson, Hugh Henry Breckinridge, and Charles Brockden Brown, none had succeeded in solving the problem that confronted the writers of Child's generation: the creation of a distinctive national literature rooted in American soil. Rowson and Brown, however, had identified key elements of such a solution. In Reuben and Rachel, 1798, Rowson had provided an epic that not only commemorated the discovery, conquest, and settlement of the New World, but probed the complex relations between its European and Indian peoples. And in Edgar Huntley, Brown had transferred the Gothic novel from a European to an American setting, where the incidents of Indian hostility, and the perils of the western wilderness replaced sadistic priests and haunted castles as mainsprings of terror. 5 of the two, Rosen came closer to furnishing Child with a congenial model, for unlike most of her successors, she perceived that the interactions between Spanish and English settlers and Indians had taken a range of forms besides wars. Of extermination, forms that included the assimilation of Indian converts into early colonial Spanish and English society, the assimilation of European captives into Indian tribes, and a degree of cross-fertilization among the various cultures. Even more significantly, Rosen, who self-consciously announced in her preface that she presumed to write for my own sex only, had revised the historical record to give women a leading role. It is intriguing to speculate about the influence Rosen might have had on Child, whose historical fiction would exhibit the same proto-feminist thrust and revisionist daring. By a curious coincidence, Rosen was running a school for girls in Medford during Child's infancy, and she died in Boston the year Hobomok appeared on the local market. 7 But no evidence suggests that the two women's paths ever crossed, or that Child ever read Reuben and Rachel, though she did express an unflattering opinion of Rosen's best-selling novel of seduction, Charlotte Temple. It has a nice good moral at the end, and I dare say was written with the best intention, yet I believe few works do so much harm to girls of 14 or 15. Writing when the historical novel was still fluid, Rosen never managed to shape it into a paradigm that an emergent national literature could adopt. Not until Scott brought the historical novel to maturity in the second decade of the 19th century, the decade when Child was sharing her impressions of his novels with converse, did American writers find a genre suited to their purposes. Designed specifically to forge a nationalist consciousness and cultural identity in the newly independent United States, the American historical novel inevitably exhibited the same central contradiction as American history itself: the contradiction between an ideology based on the premise that all men are created equal and a political structure based on the assumption that people of color and white women do not fall under the rubric men. Like its British prototype, the American version of the genre developed by Scott celebrated the triumph of a technologically advanced civilization over a tribal society. Unlike Scott, however, identified by birth with one of the defeated ethnic groups whose heroic struggle against Norman and British invaders he memorialized, American writers belonged to the conquering race, which constituted their sole audience. Their mission was not to reconcile the victor with the vanquished, nor to offer a healing vision of the two groups' eventual amalgamation under the victor's hegemony. Rather, it was to justify the complete obliteration of the vanquished race and at the same time to assert the victor's own cultural independence vis-a-vis the British they had just overthrown. 9. Ironically, as American writers were to find, the key to establishing a distinctive cultural identity lay in exploiting the culture of the very race their compatriots were so brutally extirpating. An early 19th century critic writing for the North American Review, the journal that was to formulate the first major theory of American literature, put the case bluntly. The United States was deficient in literature because its colonial existence, inherently opposed to literary originality, had deprived it of the basis for a true national literature. The remotest germs of literature are the native peculiarities of the country in which it is to spring, he pointed out, and a national literature seems to be the legitimate product of a national language. Yet colonialism had saddled Americans with a literary tradition rooted in another continent and with a language suited perhaps to describing the serenity of the Thames, but far too tame to convey the majesty of the Mississippi or the grandeur of Niagara. These handicaps notwithstanding, the critic contended, America did in fact have an indigenous literature that displayed genuine originality, haughty independence of foreign influences, and poetic vigor equal to soaring with the eagle and thundering with the cataract, the oral literature of its aborigines. Critics in later numbers of the North American Review were quick to draw the inference, if American writers could mine the linguistic and mythological riches of this literature, they would develop the means of escaping their humiliating cultural subservience to England.
And that is sort of explicitly what Frantz Fanon writes about in the Wretched of the Earth that we mentioned on the Pioneers episode most recently. I actually want to hurry and play the preface so you can get a taste of it. The preface is actually one of the most interesting parts of this book because it demonstrates how like books were exciting. I don't know, it seems weird to say, but like the way that they're like blockbusters, the way that she talks about the latest Walter Scott and then The Coming, she hints at Fenimore Cooper's The Pilot coming out. She's like a fan. We'll just play it here.
Preface. In the summer of 1823, my friend entered my study with an air which indicated he had something to communicate. "Frederick," says he, "do you know I have been thinking of a new plan lately?" "A wise one, no doubt," replied I, "but, prithee, what is it?" "Why, to confess the truth, your friend P.S. remarks concerning our early history, have half tempted me to write a New England novel." "A novel?" quoth I, when Waverley is galloping over hill and dale, faster and more successful than Alexander's conquering sword? Even American ground is occupied. The spy is lurking in every closet. The mind is everywhere supplied with pioneers on the land, and is soon likely to be with pilots on the deep. "I know that," replied he. "Scott wanders over every land."
See, the spy, pioneers, and pilots on the deep, the three first James Fenimore Cooper novels.
Alexander's conquering sword? Even American ground is occupied. The spy is lurking in every closet. The mind is everywhere supplied with pioneers on the land, and is soon likely to be with pilots on the deep. "I know that," replied he. "Scott wanders over every land with the same proud, elastic tread, free as the mountain breeze, and majestic as the bird that bathes in the sunbeams. He must always stand alone, a high and solitary shrine, before which minds of humbler mould are compelled to bow down and worship. I did not mean," added he, smiling, "that my wildest hopes, hardly my wildest wishes, had placed me even within sight of the proud summit which has been gained either by Sir Walter Scott, or Mr. Cooper. I am aware that the subject which called forth your friend's animated observations, owed its romantic coloring almost wholly to his own rich imagination. Still, barren and uninteresting as New England history is, I feel there is enough connected with it, to rouse the dormant energies of my soul, and I would fain deserve some other epitaph than that he lived and died. I knew that my friend, under an awkward and unprepossessing appearance, concealed more talents than the world was aware of. I likewise knew that when he once started in the race, the "I'll take the hindmost" was his favorite motto. So I e'en resolved to favor the project, and to procure for him as many old, historical pamphlets as possible. A few weeks after, my friend again entered my apartment, and gave me a package, as he said, "Here are my manuscripts, and it rests entirely with you, whether or not to give them to the public. You, and every one acquainted with our earliest history, will perceive that I owe many a quaint expression, and pithy sentence, to the old and forgotten manuscripts of those times. The ardor with which I commenced this task, has almost wholly abated. Seriously, Frederick, what chance is there that I, who so seldom peep out from the loopholes of retreat, upon a gay and busy world, can have written anything which will meet their approbation? Besides, the work is full of faults, which I have talents enough to see, but not to correct. It has indeed fallen far short of the standard which I had raised in my own mind. You well know that state of feeling, when the soul fixes her keen vision on distant brightness, but in vain stretches her feeble and spellbound wing, for a flight so lofty. The world would smile, continued he, to hear me talk thus, concerning a production, which will probably never rise to the surface with other ephemeral trifles of the day, but painful, anxious timidity must unavoidably be felt by a young author in his first attempt. However, I will talk no more about it. What is writ would it were worthier. If I succeed, the voice of...
Yeah, so you get like the obligatory preface humility there. Then we get into chapter 1. It starts off with very sort of appeal to patriotism here. It says, I never view the thriving villages of New England, which speak so forcibly to the heart of happiness and prosperity, without feeling a glow of national pride as I say, this is my own, my native land. A long train of associations are connected with her picturesque rivers as they repose in their peaceful loveliness and broad and sparkling mirror of the heavens. Now, if we wanted to nitpick there, and I think we should, this is the place for it. Of course, it's saying quite a lot to say this is my own, my native land when you're, dispossessor of natives, and this book is in fact about that. So I think there's some irony to that. Yeah, chapter 1, the inhabitants of Namkeek, which is, as we'd later know as Salem, greet new arrivals from England. After dark, Mary Conant goes to the woods to perform a love ritual, some witchcraft. She expects Charles Brown to be the suitor, and in fact, Hobomok, the Native American, appears. when she says, who's going to be my husband?
The rays of the full moon rested on her face, and I at once perceived that it was Mary Conant. Had my first fears been realized, I know not that I should have felt more surprise. Among all my conjectures, I could not possibly imagine for what purpose she could be making an excursion at that lonely hour of the night. I remembered the hint, which her father had given, concerning the beguilement of her silly heart, and I could not but suspect that this walk was, in some way or other, connected with the young Episcopalian. Whatever was her project, she seemed half fearful of performing it, for she cast a keen, searching glance behind, and a long, fearful look, at the woods beneath, before she plunged into the thicket. After a moment's consideration, I resolved to follow her, and stepping from behind a tree which had afforded me concealment, I cautiously proceeded along the path which she had taken. She had stopped near a small brook, and when I first discovered her, she had stooped beside it, and taking a knife from her pocket, she opened a vein in her little arm, and dipping a feather in the blood, wrote something on a piece of white cloth, which was spread before her. She rose with a face pale as marble, and looking round timidly, she muttered a few words too low to meet my ear, then taking a stick and marking out a large circle on the margin of the stream, she stepped into the magic ring, walked round 3 times with measured tread, then carefully retraced her steps backward, speaking all the while in a distinct but trembling voice. The following were the only words I could hear. "Whoever's to claim a husband's power, come to me in the moonlight hour." And again "Whoever my bridegroom is to be, step in the circle after me." She looked round anxiously as she completed the ceremony, and I almost echoed her involuntary shriek of terror, when I saw a young Indian spring forward into the center. "What for makes you afraid of Hobomok?" said the savage, who seemed scarcely less surprised than herself. "Wherefore did you come hither?" replied the maiden, after the tones of his voice had convinced her that he was real flesh and blood. "Hobomok much late has been out to watch the deer tracks," answered the Indian, "and he came through the hollow, that he might make the Manito Asana * green as the oak tree."
So right away, I'd say a more scandalous, setup than, a lot of things that we've read. We find out things, there's a bit of dwelling on how bleak things are in Salem. Talk about Episcopalians. Charles Brown, we should mention, there's the love triangle between Hobomok, Charles Brown, and Mary Conant. And basically the rough symbolism there is the Episcopalian Charles Brown he sort of represents culture. He goes back to England. He sends some gifts. He's adventurous kind of guy as well. And Hobomok represents nature. And now that's a bit complicated for both of them because they also have attributes of the other in a way that I think is commendable for Lydia Maria in this book. Another thing I find interesting about this book, and it really drew me in, is her use of real characters. John Oldham being the most notable. Oldham, if you go back and listen to the Pequot War episode, his murder is was cited as one of the reasons that we had to massacre, or I say we as identifying with the colonizers, but why the colonists massacred the Pequot Indians. Oldham himself was a very interesting character, and in fact is represented here as such. Although he is represented as a traitor. Mary's father, who really hates Episcopalians, he mentions Oldham the first time as, where I don't smoke tobacco, but Oldham's probably got some. So he's a traitor, and he's a very gruff, he also likes to laugh. Humor is important to him, but a very interesting character. But the John Oldham, the real one, himself, not only was he murdered in a way that in one of the inciting events of the Pequot War, but earlier than that, he was banished from Plymouth Plantation. And I'll just read from the Wikipedia here. Oldham is proof that relations were not always harmonious among the Pilgrims. Over half of those who sailed on the Mayflower had come for economic opportunity rather than religious motivations. In 1624, Reverend John Lyford came over to America and was welcomed at first, but soon Plymouth residents gravitated to him who did not share the Puritans' viewpoints. Lyford gave them encouragement and met with them in secret. Oldham was a supporter of Lyford, and the two of them stirred up dissension and trouble in Plymouth, according to the accounts of Pilgrim leader William Bradford. And the letter sort of came out, and it was a big scandal. Actually, I lied when I said I won't have any other sources here. I want to bring in the American History Podcast. I'm not sure who this is by, but I'll link to it in the show notes. There's actually an episode on the Lyford Affair.
Publicly, Lyford made a tearful confession of his faith, but it sounded phony and Bradford was skeptical. He didn't call him out, though. He just kept an eye on him. Lyford almost immediately joined with another non-pilgrim named John Oldham, who himself had already sent letters to London criticizing the colony and its leadership to the merchant investors. These criticisms had included criticism of everyday life, policy, and even the colony's religious nature. Lyford joined in sending these letters. He ran a serious risk of driving away influential supporters, especially because the Pilgrims hadn't been able to give investors a return on their money. When confronted, Lyford denied the accusations, but he also baptized the children of one of the non-Pilgrims in the colony. Bradford was determined to find out what was going on, so he asked the captain of the next boat carrying mail to England to pause after they were beyond the view of the Plymouth colonists. Bradford then followed in a small boat, intercepted the vessel, and opened Lyford's mail. There he found it full of accusations, many of which Bradford said were false. It seemed clear that Lyford and Oldham were partnering with a faction of investors at home and planning to overturn the religious and political leadership of the colony, ending the independence movement within the colony and turning it into a mainstream Puritan town. Bradford didn't confront Lyford right away. He waited to see how the situation developed. One Sunday, Lyford and his supporters refused to join the Pilgrim congregation for services, setting up their own church with Lyford as a minister. And at this point, Bradford had had enough. He put Lyford and Oldham on trial, and Lyford denied the accusations. So Bradford produced the letters and showed them to the entire colony. Lyford said he'd just been repeating complaints from people like Billington, but Billington and the others denied having participated. They said that while they'd gone to his meetings, they would never have consented to something like this. It was clear that Lyford and Oldham had to go. The Pilgrims had come to America to build a colony that adhered to their religious and political ideals, and the two were putting that mission at serious risk. The colonists put Oldham through a gauntlet where the settlers beat him with the butt ends of their muskets, and then both he and Lyford were sentenced to exile. Oldham would be expelled immediately, but since Lyford had a wife and kids, they let him stay 6 months to take care of them. Lyford made a second, even more tearful confession of faith, but he immediately began to write letters to London again, and then his wife came forward and told the colonists about his previous affairs and illegitimate children, as well as the rape he had committed in Ireland.
Jesus.
Lyford and Oldham briefly stayed with a new band of colonists at Nam Keag, which would later become Salem. And from there, they hitched a ride to Virginia, where Lyford seems to have been made a minister at either the Wests or John Morton's plantation, but died just a few months later. Oldham later apologized for his participation in the affair and rejoined the Plymouth colony. In London, the Lyford...
Lyford is first mentioned as someone who says, who was, before the ship arrives in Salem, as one of the naysayers, who says, like, it's actually really bad, whereas other people saying it's amazing, and it turns out Lyford was right. But the representation of Oldham and Lyford is not true to history, but it's true to Child's habit of taking peripheral characters and moving them to the center. Hobomok himself is another one. He's based on a real Native American. I believe the Hobomok, Hobbamock, is how I think the historical one is spelled, or referenced anyway. And he was a Native American that was a sort of diplomat to the Salem people. He came in sort of a rival to Squanto in a little bit of ways. There's a weird moment where he accuses Squanto of being in on a planned attack, and it's unclear who is telling the truth. Squanto's not in Hobomok, but Corbetant is. Corbetant is a Native American who was, skeptical of alliances with the English colonists. I think, in the parlance, that he's a sort of stereotypical bad Indian. Our modern language has better, I think, terms for him. I think Killmonger, perhaps, is another lens to view him through. So yeah, the ship comes. Mr. Conant is sermonizing about. It says, and actually, it's a shame Alex isn't here because he might be able to break down the biblical importance of this. But Mary's father, the hard-headed, puritanical Mr. Conant, says, "Since Namkeek has been old enough to receive a Christian name, say ye to them that in Salem in his tabernacle, and in his dwelling place in Zion, here he will break the arrows of the bow, the shield, the sword, and the battle." And Corbetant, who's the who wants to go to war with the English, overhears that. He's like, "What do you mean by there's going to be broken arrows?"
And since Namkeek has become old enough to receive a Christian name, say ye to them that in Salem is his tabernacle, and his dwelling place in Zion. Here he will break the arrows of the bow, the shield, the sword, and the battle. But to them who are yet given to the pride of prelacy, and the abomination of common prayer, and likewise to them who are weather waft up and down with every eddying wind of every new doctrine, say ye to them, that their damnation sleepeth not, and the mist of darkness is reserved for them forever, being of old ordained to condemnation. This speech was fiercely answered by a dark, lowering-looking savage, who stood among the crowd. "That is Corbetant," said Mary "What is it that he says?" "Your father say Indian arrow be broken at Namkeek," replied Hobomok Corbetant say the feather be first red with white man's blood. He would have added more, but the vessels were now sweeping past the rock on which they stood, and every eye was fixed on their motion. Many a hearty salutation, and blunt compliment were paid to Sally Oldham, and many a hat was waved in respectful adieu to Mrs. Conant and her daughter.
So yeah, Hobomok was a Pokanoket Pnees, a representative to Massasoit, sachem of the Wampanoag. They were sort of advisors, administrative delegates, sort of the cabinet. They collected tribute, led warriors into battle, and advised on the distribution or sale of land. And Squanto and Hobomok, I don't know if Squanto himself was a Pnees, but basically as diplomats they would also be informants for the settlers, very useful in that way, and also made their existence pretty precarious from both directions, frankly. And Hobomok immediately tells Mary what how Corbetant interpreted it might be biblical, but it is very fierce. And when you think about it, is Corbetant really wrong to interpret it as a threat? I think subsequent history might prove his perspective a little bit on that. And actually, let's go a bit, another mention of Lyford, who does not come out of this looking well. He's actually a bit of a creep. And we'll hear Mary tell Sally, the daughter of John Oldham, Sally Oldham, which is her best friend. They're sort of the dual heroines, and I think they have more agency than maybe Fenimore Cooper heroines would. And she tells Sally about the mystic love ritual she did.
"And when Jacob knew Rachel he kissed her," continued he, as he courageously put his arm round her neck, to suit his action to the words. I have had enough of that from the sanctified Mr. Lyford, said the resolute maiden, as she gave him a blow, which
Basically, we have a failed attempt at courtship by Mr. Graves.
Insinuating smiles. And when Jacob knew Rachel he kissed her, continued he, as he courageously put his arm round her neck, to suit his action to the words. I have had enough of that from the sanctified Mr. Lyford, said the resolute maiden, as she gave him a blow, which occasioned a sudden and involuntary retreat. Well done, Sally, said the hoarse voice of her father, who just then stepped from among the trees, half choked with laughter, and for a moment forgetful of the decorum which he usually maintained in her presence. Why, fellow, thou art smitten indeed, but it ill beseemeth thee to put on a rueful face at this disaster. The damsel is not worth the tears, which an onion draweth forth. Sally gladly left her discomfited lover to recover himself as he could, and bidding a hasty good morning to Hobomok, as he stood laughing and muttering to himself, she followed Mary, who with an air of girlish confidence had beckoned her into a narrow footpath which led through the woods. For a few moments the girls united in almost convulsive fits of laughter. Did you ever see such a fellow? Said Sally. Every day since they landed, he has been at my elbow, trying to make love by stammering and stuttering about the crackling thorns of worldly mirth, and I verily think he believes that I have been greatly delighted therewith. A plague on all such sanctified-looking folks. There was Mr. Lyford, I don't care if he was a minister, he was always talking about faith and righteousness, and the falling off of the Plymouth elders, and yet many a sly look and word he'd give me, when his good woman was out of the way. I marvel that fools can always find utterance, inasmuch as some men of sense are so dumb. Men of sense will speak all in good time, if you will wait patiently, answered Mary. But you don't know how glad I...
So given the high-profile abuse, especially by powerful men, I'm thinking Jeffrey Epstein, but many, many others, and how the conspiracy just, that's allowed if you've achieved a certain status in society. I think this is very I think this is very interesting to see this in how timeless I think that dynamic is.
And yet many a sly look and
or is proved.
Word he'd give me, when his good Lyford, I don't care if he was a minister, he was always talking about faith and righteousness, and the falling off of the Plymouth elders, and yet many a sly look and word he'd give me, when his good woman was out of the way. I marvel that fools can always find utterance, inasmuch as some men of sense are so dumb. Men of sense will speak all in good time, if you will wait patiently, answered Mary. But you don't know how glad I am that it happened to be your father, instead of mine, who saw you strike Mr. Graves. So am I, replied her companion. Though he is your father, to my thinking he is over fond of keeping folks in a straight jacket, and I'm sure our belt is likely to be buckled tight enough by the great folks there in London. In my poor judgment it is bad enough that we've come over into this wilderness to find elbow room for our consciences, without being told how long a time we may have to stop and breathe in. Every bout I knit in my stocking is to be set down in black and white, and sent over to the London Company forsooth. I suppose by and by the drops we drink and the mouthfuls we eat must be...
Now this is interesting that, how they're knitting for the London Company, so their existence is built on them being able to produce commodities, and also the idea that you go over for elbow room, which is, and in Hope Leslie there's a thing where, we came over here to have it our way, or I can't remember exactly the terminology. But it's interesting to hear that so soon after the revolution. This is about a little 50 years. In fact, another fun fact is Child was at the 50-year commemoration that Lafayette was also, Marquis de Lafayette attended.
And breathe in. Every bout I knit in my stocking is to be set down in black and white, and sent over to the London Company forsooth. I suppose by and by the drops we drink and the mouthfuls we eat must be counted, and their number sent thither. I am sure, replied Mary, when you remember how many Indians we have lately met, whom Morton's unthinking wickedness has armed with powder and firelocks, you will be glad that we have 300 more defenders around us, whatever price we may pay therefor. Indeed, Sally.
That's already the second reference in this book to our good buddy Thomas Morton, who was had his maypole at Marymount, enjoyed having good times, and also traded guns with Native Americans, which really concerns them. And actually, even later, he's mentioned that his acts are making Native Americans really bold in a way that's not helpful.
Glad that we have 300 more defenders around us, whatever price we may pay therefor.
Sorry, to stop again, but it also reminds me of, the historicity of Lyford and John Oldham as guys who were there mainly for the economic gain, less interested in the whole, like, strict religious authority following. And that's a side of things that I think is definitely underrepresented. I could imagine a very funny period comedy about the people who are there mainly to make money, as they have to act pious, more pious than they really are, and for reasons of taste and what taste was considered at that time, you're not going to hear a lot of those narratives. So where you do see them, like Oldham, for instance, in this book, to see, and it's not real. It's definitely sanitized a little bit, but it's definitely interesting.
Lately met, whom Morton's unthinking wickedness has armed with powder and firelocks. You will be glad that we have 300 more defenders around us, whatever price we may pay therefor. Indeed, Sally, I'm weary of this wilderness life. My heart yearns for England, and had it not been for my good mother, I would gladly have left Namkeek today. I can't but admire ye been content so long, Miss Mary, considering what ye left behind you. If you'd stayed there, who knows but you might have been Lady Lincoln. But as for this purlieu of creation, I know of no chance a body has for a husband, without they pick up some strain Aragansett, or wandering Tarratine. Oh, don't name such a thing, said Mary, shuddering. Why, what makes you take me in earnest? Answered Sally. But perhaps since there are so many young folks to pick and choose among, you'll be weary of my crackling mirth, as that stupid Graves calls it. No, Sally, these newcomers won't make me forget how kind you have always been in sickness and health, but, to tell you the truth, there is something troubles me, and if you'll promise not to tell of it, I'll tell you. Oh, I'll promise that, and keep it too. If I was disposed to tell your secrets, I don't know anybody but owls and bats I should tell them to. Well then, you must know, the other night I did a wicked thing. It frightens me to think thereof. You know the trick I told you about? Well, a few weeks ago, I tried it, and just as I was saying over the verses the third time, Hobomok, the Indian, jumped into the circle. Hobomok, the Indian. Yes, and I screamed when I saw him. I believe so indeed. But was it he, real flesh and blood? It was he himself, though I thought at first, it must be his ghost. But how came he there, at that time of night? That's more than I can tell. He said he came to throw a bough on the sacrifice heap, down in Endicott's Hollow, but I don't know what should put it into his head just at that time. What do you suppose did? I'm sure I don't know, Mary. I think it is an awful wicked thing to try these tricks. There's no telling what may come of asking the devil's assistance. He is an acquaintance not so easily shook off, when you've once spoke with him, to my certain knowledge. My father says he's no doubt the Lord has given Beelzebub power to choose many a damsel's husband, to recompense her for such like wickedness. I'm sure I have been curious enough to know, but I never dared to speak to Satan about the matter. I believe it is a sin to be repented of, but what could I do? Father won't suffer me to see Charles anywhere, if he can help it, and if I dared to be disobedient to him, I wouldn't do it while my poor mother was alive.
So yeah, in this you get a lot of what this book is about, which is it's not very woke in terms of race. It's more woke than typical literature at its time. In that we eventually get well, I won't spoil anything yet, but what it really is about patriarchy. So you have Lyford, who's a lecherous kind of guy, despite his place in power, and you have Mary's father, and that upsets Sally. And you have Mary's father, who won't let her go out, follow her heart and marry Charles Brown because he's Episcopalian. And what that drives her to do is the scariest thing of all, is witchcraft. even scarier for these fathers is the love. Mary does the mystic love ritual, and she sees, and it's like, show me my husband. And the first person she sees is Hobomok, and the second person she sees is Charles Brown. That's called foreshadowing, folks. So yeah, chapter 3, we have more of the courtship narratives. Mr. Graves comes back to try to court Sally again. He falls on his ass. And John Oldham is trying to teach his wife and daughter Sally some piety, but says two quotes that are harsher than you typically see in characters in literature. She tells Mary, "You talk like a prating idiot." They're talking about religious stuff, and Sally interrupts, saying, "I think things are less severe than you say," and he says, "You talk like a prating idiot, as you are," which is pretty intense. It says, "What with your own hankering after French gewgaws and the grand stories of your Moabish companion, you have your head clean turned from the sound sense of sober godliness." And his wife sticks up for her, and he says, "You utter the sayings of a foolish woman." And so, which is pretty intense, and like just verbal abuse. And then he starts laughing at Graves falling on his ass, and they all get along again. Chapter 4, we have a conflict between Corbitant and Hobomok. Morton is again blamed for, making the Native Americans feel a bit too menacing, or get a bit too menacing.
At the period of which we speak, the thoughtless and dissipated Morton, whom we find mentioned so frequently in our early history, had done much to diminish their reverence for the English. Partly from avarice, and partly from revenge of Governor Endicott's spirited proceedings against his company at Merry Mount, he had sold them rifles, and taught them to take a steady and quick-sighted aim, so that they now boasted they could speak thunder and spit fire as well as the white man. Of late, too, their counsels became dark and contentious, for their princes began to fear encroachments upon their dominions, and their prophets were troubled with rumors of a strange god.
Corbitant taunts Hobomok for caring about the settlers. There's a weird part where Hobomok basically knows that his race is doomed, and it makes him sort of depressed, I guess. It's very strange. Anyway, when Corbitant and Hobomok fight over their dispute, Hobomok almost kills him. Chapter 5, Mary's mom gets sick. Hobomok comforts her. There's a lot of talk of alliances between tribes. Hobomok warns of a threat from Corbitant, and ultimately that threat is foiled, and the natives are captured. That's one thing that distinguishes this, is there's not a successful raid against settlers. There is in Hope Leslie, of course. I want to go back to Karcher again. And she talks a little bit about Child's naivety. She was only 22 when she wrote this, and she was reliant on sources that are significantly less, fair, to put it bluntly, than the ones we have now, particularly to the Native American side of things. In terms of especially like the Pequot War, her interpretation of the Pequot War is significantly less nuanced than Catherine Maria Sedgwick's would be in Hope Leslie.
And delivered over to her father, who generously forgives her disobedience. Yamoyden sacrifices his life to save his hitherto estranged father-in-law from an Indian's tomahawk, and Nora dies in her husband's arms as her father promises to raise the couple's baby. 22 What becomes of this baby? The poem's epilogue does not specify, but the concluding lament over the tragic outcome of the marriage and of the Indian uprising intertwined with it does not portend a hopeful resolution.
That's talking about a poem called Yamoyden, which came out before Child wrote Hobomok, and is indeed probably the main inspiration for it.
responsible for the uprising, the Puritans' execution of 3 Wampanoag warriors. Still, Eastburn and Sands, like Cooper, centered their epic on race war and ended it with a reassertion of patriarchal authority. The love affair between the Nipnet Yomoyden and the Puritan Nora, which initially points toward an alternative future for the two warring races, and a larger role in determining her own destiny for the Anglo-American woman, culminates in tragedy. Nora is captured and delivered over to her father, who generously forgives her disobedience. Yomoyden sacrifices his life to save his hitherto estranged father-in-law from an Indian's tomahawk, and Nora dies in her husband's arms as her father promises to raise the couple's baby. What becomes of this baby the poem's epilogue does not specify, but the concluding lament over the tragic outcome of the marriage and of the Indian uprising intertwined with it does not portend a hopeful resolution for the child of the racial conflicts that have doomed the parents. No doubt this reassuring negation of a threat to white supremacy and patriarchal authority saved Eastburn and Sands from the censure child would reap when she followed their lead in violating the taboo against interracial marriage. At the time she wrote Hobomok, Child evidently had a much lower level of political consciousness on the Indian question than Eastburn and Sands did. She had not yet begun to contest the Puritan chronicler's version of the wars that decimated the Indians, as she would 5 years later in a book aimed at arousing opposition to the U.S. government's crooked and narrow-minded policy toward Indians, the first settlers of New England, 1829.23. Nor had she come to see the Indians who defended their people's sovereign existence and territorial rights, rather than those who sided with the whites, as the true heroes of an American national epic. Unlike Yomoyden, who joins King Philip's uprising despite the pleadings of his English wife, Child's Hobomok betrays an Indian conspiracy to save his white beloved and her family from massacre. Child also stereotypes Hobomok's adversary, Corbett, a militant foe of the English usurpers, as a villainous bad Indian. What dictates the plot of Hobomok is not its author's awareness of racial issues, but her rebellion against patriarchy. Nevertheless, the result is a revolutionary insight into the connection between male dominance and white supremacy. This insight suggested to Child the central theme of Hobomok and indeed of her entire life as a reformer and writer, interracial marriage, symbolizing both the natural alliance between white women and people of color, and the natural resolution of America's racial and sexual contradictions. Thus, if we are to understand Hobomok and the alternative vision of race and gender relations it introduces into American literature, we must take as our starting point the defiance of patriarchy that governs its fictional strategies. Even the most seemingly conventional strategies Child uses turn out to be subversive. The book's main formal device, for example, the pretense of relying on an old, worn-out manuscript, 6, allows Child to appropriate the narrative authority of the Puritan chroniclers while rewriting the hagiography they had bequeathed to posterity. It also allows her to evade the sanctions against female authorship by speaking through a series of male narrators. Signed by an American, Hobomok was published anonymously, for Child had been gravely warned that no woman could expect to be regarded as a lady after she had written a book. Under the cover of her principal male narrator, the purported editor of the old, worn-out manuscript allegedly written by an ancestor who debarked at Namkik in 1629, 6, Child announces at the outset that her source demands considerable revision. Its style is antiquated and almost unintelligible, its content too familiar to readers brought up on John Winthrop's journal, William Hubbard's General History of New England, and Nathaniel Morton's New England's Memorial to bear repetition. Everyone acquainted with our early history remembers the wretched state in which newcomers found the scanty remnant of their brethren at Namkik, she asserts. Hence, Child plans to substitute her own language and to pass over her source's dreary account of sickness and distress. The effect of these revisions, of course, is to undermine the authority of the original text and to deflate the myth that such dreary accounts served to consecrate the myth of heroic martyrs battling God's enemies in the wilderness. The deflation is quite explicit in Child's description of the colony as it appeared to her ancestor, with 6 miserable hovels constituting the whole settlement of Namkik and a few sickly and half-starved inhabitants presenting a pitiful contrast to the vigorous and wandering savages who stood among them. A glance at Child's sources, which cite half a score of houses in lieu of 6 miserable hovels, 26 reveals how consciously she went about writing an alternative history of the Puritan experiment, one that highlighted its underside and shifted the focus from the saints to the sinners, from the orthodox to the heterodox, from the white settlers to the Indians, from the venerated patriarchs to their unsung wives. To begin with, the historical prototypes of her principal male characters all occupied either marginal or deviant status in the Puritan community. Roger Conant and John Oldham were disaffected members of the Plymouth colony. Oldham, in fact, had been expelled from Plymouth for fomenting dissension, along with the Reverend John Lyford, to whose lechery Child alludes. 19. Later, Oldham's murder by Indians, which Child's the first settlers of New England would blame on his hot temper, helped touch off the Pequot War. Ironically, in Hobomok, Child transforms this humorless bigot into a jocular gadfly who blasphemes the mysteries of godliness and laughs at his own disgraces with the most shameless effrontery. 11-12. As for Conant, credited by Hubbard with courage and resolution to abide fixed in his purpose, notwithstanding all opposition and persuasion he met, Child brings him to his knees by forcing him to accept his daughter's successive marriages to two men his religion brands as outcasts, the Indian Hobomok and the Episcopalian Charles Brown. Even more historically marginal than Oldham and Conant, the Episcopalian Samuel and John Brown are mentioned only briefly in the Chronicles. They never reappeared in Nomkeek after their banishment by John Endicott for speeches and practices tending to mutiny and faction. 29 fusing them into her hero Charles Brown, however, whom she pointedly names after the king the Puritans had fled. Child awards him the hand of her heroine and an honorable place in the colony that has previously exiled him. As an Indian, the historical Hobomok was by definition a marginal figure in Puritan eyes, albeit a valued ally. Sometimes confused by the chroniclers with the god whose name he bore, a deity that a Puritan woman was hanged for allegedly taking as her husband in 165,330, Hobomok did earn this accolade for furthering the colonists' peace with the natives. Hobomok, who came to live amongst the English, he being a proper lusty young man, and one that was in account amongst the Indians in those parts for his valor, continued faithful and constant to the English until his death. He, with the said Squanto, being sent amongst the Indians about business for the English, were surprised by an Indian sachem named Corbett, who was no friend to the English, and offered to stab Hobomok, who being a strong man, soon cleared himself of him, and with speed came and gave intelligence to the governor of Plymouth. Though retaining these details, Child goes her sources one better by elevating Hobomok to the rank of title character, marrying him to her Puritan heroine, and integrating the couple's son into white society, a daring inversion of her Puritan ancestors' errand into the wilderness. 32. Repeatedly, Child revises patriarchal script by turning the peripheral into the central into the peripheral. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the leading roles she accords the wives and daughters of the patriarchs, literally invisible in the Chronicles.
I did forget to mention that I think I did, that she cited it as, or that she signed the book as an American, so, sort of projecting a male identity. But I do think that's interesting, the way she puts peripheral characters like Lyford and Oldham into the book like that. Very interesting. So chapter 5, her Mary's mother gets sick, and chapter 6, you have we stop the attack of Corbett, and Charles Brown visits Mary against her father's orders, invites Mary to come back to England with him, and Mary declines and says she can't leave her mother because she's sick. And it was just like, just wait until she's dead, and then we can go back to England. Life was different then. So chapter 7 and 8, basically this guy Collier had asked Sally if she would marry this other guy Hopkins in England, and who was sort of more powerful in the church, and she denied him. And Collier and said, "But you, Collier, I would have you." And so Collier goes back to tell Hopkins this. Hopkins gets pissed, and then they have a church investigation into it. And the church is like, "Hopkins, you're being a dumbass, man." But at one point it gets pretty serious, and Sally has to have Mary, because she can't write, have Mary write her a statement. And Collier was cleared, and Sally was reprimanded as unladylike. And actually Oldham gets pissed off at the church for that, so there's some true history there. Chapter 9 is the sermon chapter, and we're seeing a number of these. I feel like pretty much every novel has a chapter where everyone goes to church and hears something that's sort of related to the plot. Here, a guy named Higginson is chosen as church preacher. his inaugural address, he talks about how sin is seeping into the community while gesturing at Brown and the other nonconformists. And Mary's still, of course, in love with Brown. Chapter 10, Brown gets in trouble for his nonconformity. He eventually flees, and Mary stays because of her mother again. There's another fight with Mr. Conant. Chapter 11, we start to get lost. So a big chunk of this book is Mary experiencing loss. So we have Charles Brown leaving and Sally Oldham leaving, Brown to England, Sally to Plymouth. Chapter 12, we have the winter following Brown's departure, and it's very bleak, but Hobomok pays a visit, and he starts falling for Mary. She loves his tales. There's a bit of an Othello element, critics, I think maybe Karcher, point out. One of the more interesting sort of pastimes mentioned here is hunting deer by torchlight. Now, which is basically, if you go into the woods with torches, the deer sort of get dazzled by the light. And this is something that people still do in very unsportsmanlike manner. As my father taught me, you don't do this type of shit. But it works with even better with fog lights on cars. So if you search in YouTube, spotlighting deer, I don't know, let's see if we get any videos here. Yeah, they basically just look directly into the light. And, I mean, they'll sometimes run away, but they just sort of get dazzled by it, and and then you can just shoot them because they're just sitting there. Hobomok takes Mary out on one of these hunts, and she's sort of amazed by it. There's a lot of distinctions drawn in the torchlight between the Puritan men and the native men, and I think it is interesting. There's a more of an erotic subtext to this than I guess there's some in James Fenimore Cooper too. It's interesting to think about. Karcher talks a little bit about elements of, even, I don't know if you'd call it proto-erotica, the way Hobomok is looked at by Mary. Let's actually play a little bit of this.
Fox of the Mississippi. Hobomok brought you fur for moccasins, said he, as he handed them to Mary. How very soft it is, said she, showing it to her mother. It seems like the handsome fur, which grandfather had from Russia. You did not kill it yourself, Hobomok. The Indian shook his head. His tracks are toward the setting sun, replied he. Hobomok give beaver skins like sand to a warrior come in from the west. He say they call it Musaham Shungush. There is a council fire at Mount Haup. The chiefs think the hunter came not to trade for beaver skins, but to find how heavy the red men of Assamaquan, Sasakas, Myantanimo, and Uncas. Have none of them been hither, heretofore.
So what's significant here is that, I mentioned earlier that Charles Brown, the suitor of Mary, represents sort of culture, and Hobomok represents nature. But here, Lydia Maria Child does something interesting in that you see the depth of Hobomok's culture. He has these trading connections. He can tell these stories. He's not just, killing the animals himself. Brown also is seen as proficient in nature. So the culture versus nature thing is, to Child's credit, more complex than you might think.
And of Assamaquan, Sasakas, Myantanimo, and Uncas. Have none of them been hither, heretofore? Inquired Mary. One warrior came among us in the moon of flowers and spread his blanket with us through the hunting moon. I talked with him, like as with the Yengeese. He told big stories about his tribe, but he say great spirit lay between us, and his backbone so high, make foot of the Indian weary. The chiefs said he counted red men then, but the cloud passed over. Well, rejoined Mary, I hope they'll bring more such handsome fur hither. If they come to count the red men, peradventure they'll find them too heavy. You see, I am going to make you a wampum belt of the shells you brought, and I want you to tell me how to put them together. Hobomok glad.
Yeah, and so we'll skip a little bit ahead here to the hunt.
How I do wish I could see them hunt by torchlight. I shall go out with you, said Mr. Conant, to see what success the Lord giveth us in this matter. I have heard wonderful stories appertaining to the taking of deer after this fashion. They say that in the lightest night that ever was made, the creatures are so bewitched, that they'll not move a jot, after they once get sight of the fire. And wherefore shouldn't I go, father? Asked Mary. A pretty sight truly, replied the old man, to see you out at midnight with 20 hunters. But, rejoined his wife, 2 or 3 horses can be procured, and if a few of the young folks will go, assuredly I see no harm therein, more especially as you will accompany Mary. You must remember, continued she, in an insinuating tone, that there are few such like gratifications in this wilderness. No doubt there is enough of them, wherewithal to entice their wandering hearts, answered her husband, but if you think it fitting the girl should go, verily I have no objection thereto. Preparations were accordingly made. The widow Willett agreed to come up and stay with Mrs. Conant, and a few young women readily consented to accompany Mary, on such horses as the settlement could afford. As for Hobomok, he was all eagerness to display his skill. His arrows were carefully selected, and the strength of his bow was tried again and again, as he occasionally turned to Mary, and boasted of the service it had always done him, in field and forest. Winter seldom presents a night of such glittering beauty, as the one they chose for their expedition. The mellow light of moon and star looked down upon the woods, and as the trees danced to the shrill music of the winds, their light was reflected by 10,000 undulating motions, in all the rich varieties of frost work. It seemed as if the sylphs and fairies, with which imagination of old, peopled the mountain and the stream, had all assembled to lay their diamond offerings on the great altar of nature. Silently Mary gazed on the going down of that bright planet, and tree and shrub bowed low their spangled plumes in homage to her retiring majesty, till her oblique rays were only to be seen in faint and scattered radiance, on the cold, smooth surface of the earth. At length the party were in motion, proceeding through the woods by the twinkling luster of the stars. Mr. Conant held the rein of Mary's horse, and guided his footsteps along the rough and narrow path. Hobomok walked by her side, as silent and thoughtful as he usually was in the presence of her father. They soon came out upon the open plain, and a few moments after, 6 neighboring Indians were seen winding along from the opposite woods, with their torches carried upon poles high above their heads, casting their lurid glare on the mild, tranquil light of the evening. As they drew up, a few inquiries were made by Hobomok in his native tongue, and answered by his companions in scarcely an audible tone, as they significantly placed their fingers upon their lips. Mr. Conant and his 10 associates formed a line and fell into the rear, while the Indians who carried the poles, did the same, and placed themselves forward. It was indeed a strange, romantic scene. The torches sent up columns of dense, black smoke, which vainly endeavored to rise in the clear, cold atmosphere. Hobomok stood among his brethren, gracefully leaning on his bow, and his figure might well have been mistaken for the fabled deity of the chase. The wild, fitful light shone full upon the unmoved countenance of the savage, and streamed back unbroken upon the rigid features of the Calvinist, rendered even more dark in their expression by the beaver cap which deeply shaded his careworn brow. The pale loveliness of Mary's face, amid the intense cold of the night, seemed almost as blooming as her ruddy companions, and the frozen beauty of the surrounding woods again flashed brightly beneath the unwonted glow of those artificial rays. There, in that little group, standing in the loneliness and solitude of nature, was the contrast of heathen and Christian, social and savage, elegance and strength, fierceness and timidity. Every eye bent forward, and no sound broke in upon the stillness, excepting now and then, the low, dismal growl of the wolf was heard in the distance. Whenever this fearful sound came upon the ear, the girls would involuntarily move nearer to their protectors, who repeatedly assured them that wolves would never approach a fire. Presently a quick, light step was heard, and a deer glided before them. The beautiful animal, with rapid and graceful motion, was fast hurrying to the woods, when his eye seemed caught by the singular light which gleamed around him. He paused, and looking back, turned his pert, inquiring gaze full upon the hunters. He saw the forms of men, and knew they were his enemies, but so powerful was the fascination of the torches, that his majestic antlers seemed motionless as the adjacent shrubbery. The arrow of Hobomok was already drawn to the head, when Mary touched his shoulder, as she said, "Don't kill it, Hobomok Don T," but the weapon was already on the wing, and from his hand it seldom missed its mark.
Yeah, and actually that mirrors the scene in The Pioneers, where Elizabeth Temple tells her father not to shoot the deer. That deer hunt actually ends in a Pioneers-like whose game is this dispute itself. But then we get to chapter 13, where despite, this experience with the Hobomok hunting, Mary's still missing Brown, specifically his, quote, unreciprocated, she's experiencing unreciprocated intellect. So Hobomok's not sufficient for her, and later that's even more explicit, where, where Child says, or where the narrator it says that Hobomok just can't quite compete. He's good, but he can't quite compete with Charles Brown in terms of intellect. Lady Arabella arrives on the ship, the Arabella, which is famous for being the one that Governor Winthrop came on. There's much talk. She says, our own mighty kingdom was once a remote province of the Roman Empire, or that's what she says her husband said. Chapter 13, Brown has sent a bunch of letters. Book including the Fairy Queen. He sent Hobomok a pipe. Hobomok and Charles are tight together, or at least friendly. But yeah, a lot of gifts, and he says he's going to the West Indies for his for riches. So, chapter 15, we have more loss for Mary. Lady Arabella declines, and so does her mother. Then Mrs. Conant on her deathbed this is where she tells Mr. Conant to let marry Brown, and he basically accepts, somewhat begrudgingly, but not too much. She dies. Arabella dies and gifts Mary a ring. Chapter 16, Mary's lonely. She's uninterested even in Hobomok. She gets the news that we got more loss. Charles Brown has been in a shipwreck, and he's feared dead. And in fact, Governor Endicott confirms that he's dead. Mr. Conant tries and fails to commiserate with Mary, and the interesting bit of a psychological realism is Mr. Conant. He didn't want to let his daughter marry Brown. Didn't want to let Mary marry Brown. But when his wife told him to, he was really looking forward to the moment where he could be the good guy. And when he heard that Charles died, he was very upset, or more upset than he was expecting, that he wasn't going to get that moment. But he's trying, but ultimately he is going to push Mary away. Chapter 17, Mary visits her mother's grave. Hobomok visits her there. And Mary basically decides to leave with Hobomok. She goes back, and when she hears her father, she feels like she can't leave him. But she get into an argument, and Mr. Conant throws Charles's Bible at the fire, and that's the last straw. So Mary decides to abscond with Hobomok. Hobomok, there's a mention on page 123 here of the edition edited by Karcher. Hobomok is worried about her state the entire time. He says the Indian had witnessed the dreadful ruins of mind in his own tribe, and the fear of her insanity more than once occurred to him. Then again, her brief answers to his questions would be so prompt and rational that he could not admit doubt. So yeah, she is communicating with the good spirit, thought he. And she goes off with him. She accepts his offer that they get married in an Indian ceremony, but she freaks out when the pipe that Charles Brown gave to Hobomok shows up, so he has to go get a different pipe. Chapter 18, Mr. Conant's worried Mary killed herself, and that he drove her to it, which would be, that'd be tough. Tough way you lose your wife and your daughter like that. Oldham does a weird anti-miscegenation rant. Everyone's sort of speculating what could have happened to Mary. And then word finally gets out. This is very upsetting to Mr. Conant to find that his daughter has married an Indian. Chapter 19, Mary is still stupefied with Hobomok. And then we have, this is where the more explicit, yeah, so here's a bit of racism, unfortunately. Kind as Hobomok was, this is chapter 19, and rich as she found his uncultivated mind in native imagination, still the contrast between him and her departed lover would often be remembered with sufficient bitterness. Besides this, she knew that her own nation looked upon her as degraded, and, what was far worse, her own heart echoed back the charge. But her friend Sally Oldham visits her, and she eventually has Hobomok's child, and starts, in fact, falling more and more in love with Hobomok. They have a playful son. And then Hobomok is out hunting, and he sees the ghost of Charles Brown. Oh, wait, it's not a ghost. It's actually Charles Brown, and he escaped after being held captive in Africa of the shipwreck. And we don't want to get into that, he says, but it's too long of a story. But I'm back now, and by the way, what's happened to Mary? And Hobomok's like, should I kill him or no? Well, first he thinks he's a ghost. And then he's like, should I kill him? And no, he can't do that. And he realizes, despite having a child with Mary, that he's got to go. I'm going to be the bigger man and step aside here. He's like, she's praying for Brown in her sleep. It's clear that she loves him more. And we have this line. Hobomok says this, good and kind she has been, but the heart of Mary is not with the Indian. In her sleep she talks with the Great Spirit, and the name of the white man is on her lips. Hobomok will go far off among some of the red men in the West. They will dig him a grave, and Mary may sing the marriage song in the wigwam of the Englishmen. So he just steps aside, basically. He goes back, looks in on Mary and the child, but decides not to go in and say goodbye personally. And then, chapter 20, Brown returns. Hobomok gets a divorce, and says he's going to die a wanderer. Mary's upset that he is going to die a wanderer, and maybe should feel a little bit of guilt about that. And then Mary and Charles marry. And page 150, the very last page of the book. This is a short book. I would actually recommend it, just in terms of, I don't know. It's just, I think, support Lydia Maria Child. So Mary names the child Charles Hobomok Conant, which, that seems to be a good, at least she's remembering Hobomok in the name, right? Well, so they inherit some money through Charles and put him into Harvard, which, if you've heard, Harvard has an interesting relationship, I guess, with Native Americans. And here's what it says, that this is how this Hobomok ends here. At his request, half of the legacy of Earl Rivers was appropriated to his education. He was afterwards a distinguished graduate of Cambridge, Harvard, and when he left that infant university, he departed to finish his studies in England. His father was seldom spoken of, and by degrees his Indian appellation was silently omitted. But the devoted, romantic love of Hobomok was never forgotten by its object, and his faithful services to the Yankees are still remembered with gratitude, though the tender slip which he protected has since become a mighty tree, and the nations of the earth seek refuge beneath its branches. So yeah, the Salem grows into the American Empire, and that's only in 1820. So if it was a mighty tree then, don't know what it is now, but well, folks, we'll have Alex and Grace back soon. I just wanted to do this one. I felt guilty, to be honest. This is one I've always kind of wanted to do, and just wasn't quite sure if I could justify it, but I wanted to get this, give it a go, especially after I heard, Cornel reference her on the show. It's unfortunate that there's not a lot of resources besides these feminist academics on Karcher. Let's talk about what's upcoming on Literary Hangover for this fall. By the way, I'd appreciate it if you became a patron at Literary Hangover or at patreon.com/Literary Hangover. We have a few Orwell essays, Bookshelf Memories, Marrakesh, Boys' Weeklies, and Charles Dickens. Those are the next 4. We'll have those over this fall. There's a few from the... we're also going to do Last of the Mohicans. The Crucible, we're going to do some witch hunt stuff, I think, around Halloween, so we're going to have to get geared up for that. I'm going to be doing jazz with a special guest. And then we might get into some Emerson, some Thoreau, and we'll see. We're going to go back into Cooper to go in The Last of the Mohicans with a better grasp of his hostility towards letting people who might breed across race survive the stories. But that's what's coming up. Thanks for this is a bit of a I appreciate it if you stuck around this far. I guess that's all I'll say about that. I appreciate you folks out there. And until next time, bye.